also a corporate member of CMA. So welcome, Ms. Sanjana Dixit. Thank you for again taking time out of your schedule and moderating this session. It's all up to you, ma'am.
For the introduction. Good evening, all. Our topic today is data visualization for effective communication. A brief on the topic. We need to know the difference between data, information, insight, and story. Data is raw and voluminous, and normally it doesn't have much meaning. Data by itself does not reveal anything because you cannot identify patterns from data. So you have to aggregate data in some way or the other. And when you aggregate data like pivot tables, that's when you start identifying patterns. And those patterns lead to insights. But just identifying patterns is not enough. You have to communicate it like a story by linking all these patterns into a smooth flow like a novel. And like in a novel, you need to create the excitement, the mystery, the revelation, and all of this happens through picturization. Picture says 1,000 words, right? And that's why picturization is important. Data visualization and storytelling is not a new thing. It's been used in the past. And some famous visualizations like Florence Nightingale's during the Crimean War that demonstrated that hygiene condition was leading to deaths rather than injury. Then we have the visualizations for Napoleon's march to Moscow and the retreat. In fact, some claim that data visualization was responsible for detecting that cholera is a waterborne disease and not an airborne one. So what's happened in recent times is because of improvement in computing power and storage costs, we are able to capture a huge amount of raw data. And most people are aware about data in customer-facing side like social media, data in CRM, and so on. Today, due to IoT devices, you are able to capture a huge amount of data even in manufacturing and use it to predict patterns. Even for environmental purposes like detection of forest fires, smart cities, you're visualizing with the help of data. While it is useful, data can also lie. People can either by design or inadvertently create a visualization that will give a false picture of what the actual scenario is. So there are methods by which you can determine that lie factor in the data. And that also needs to be understood. I'm sure we have a very exciting evening ahead. Let us learn from Dr. Ranganathan and understand more on how we can use data for our corporate communications. Dr. Kavitha Ranganathan is a faculty in the Information Systems area at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. She holds a master's in Information Systems from BITS Pilani and a master's and a Ph.D. in Computer Science from the University of Chicago. Dr. Ranganathan has been teaching data visualization courses to MBA and doctoral students, analytics professionals, and in a wide range of corporate training programs for more than a decade now. She draws from this vast and rich experience for her book, which captures the main principles for avoiding misleading graphs and creating effective and intuitive visualizations. Dr. Ranganathan lives in Ahmedabad with her husband, their 2 kids, and Coco, the youngest furry canine added to the family. And whenever she gets a free moment, Dr. Ranganathan can be found walking around the IMA campus, admiring the many species of trees and birds in this gorgeously green oasis. With that, over to you, Dr. Ranganathan. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anjana, for that very warm introduction. I'm really happy to be here. And of course, some of the graphs that you've mentioned, we're exactly going to be looking at those. For example, Napoleon's March and Florence Nightingale's graphs. So I was like, oh, wow. You already know what I'm going to talk about, but which is great. Right? I also found that we have, apart from IBM research, where I was after I graduated, we have another connection. So I'm married into an XLRI family. So we have a double connection there. So like, that's great. Okay, so let's get started. I'm a teacher by profession. So this, if this sounds like very much something that I'm teaching, bear with me because I'm so used to doing that. I'm going to start and share my PPT, if that's okay. Is that visible? Yeah. Great. So the other thing we'll do is so this is going to be an interactive session. So I've also been told that there are a lot of students here who are interested in analytics. They're actually learning data handling and visualization. So I would encourage all of you to participate in this session. The more interactive it is, the better. But I'm also told that we'll use the chat window for our interactions. So I'll have one eye on the chat window when I ask you something so that I can see your responses there. Right? Okay, so let's get started. So for those who are kind of new to the field of data visualization as such, this is kind of an amalgamation of three traditional fields that we already know about, right? So statistics, where you try to summarize data and make sense of data, make sense of numbers. And then there's design, where you want to appropriately construct things from the perspective of the audience or the user. So the design thinking aspect from design, and then of course the communication aspect. So there are theories in communication in terms of how you want to present something, how you can bring something forth effectively. So when we look at data visualization as a field, it draws, especially when you want to communicate with data and use data visualization, it draws from essentially these three different and traditionally very separate fields, which is also what drew me to data visualization initially, because I'm a computer scientist. I've been trained in methods of programming and methods of dealing with numbers, not much in terms of design. So I traditionally would be, my education would be closer to an engineering education. But along the way, when I was actually introduced to the field, there was this aha moment where I realized that just that is not enough, especially when you want to communicate effectively with data. You have to understand a lot of the design elements that go into creating effective visualizations. So which is why this becomes, of course, it's a field in its own right now, but that is why it is so unique in terms of the interdisciplinary nature of data visualization. So let's start with a very simple basic example, which is often shown if you start with any basic data visualization class. Right? So this is known as the Anscombe's quartet. So it's a very famous data set. So you will see four different sets of data here, set A, B, C, and D, and we have X and Y for each of these sets. Right? So if you try to analyze these data sets in the traditional way, so the summary stats that we use, for example, if you look at the mean, if you also look at the correlation coefficient, if you try to fit a linear model to this, that is, you'll get the same numbers. So you'll see that right up to the R² term, if you do a linear regression, it's 0.67 for all 4 data sets, A, B, C, and D. So we might land up thinking, at least from the summary stats perspective, that they are exactly the same. Till, of course, you go ahead and plot the data. So if we create very simple scatter plots, 4 different scatter plots, you will suddenly realize that these 4 data sets are very different from each other in terms of how, so suddenly you see that the visualization brings forth the inherent properties of the data, and these inherent properties were definitely not visible if we just analyze the summary statistics. So if you see the first one, so for those of you who are familiar with a scatter plot, so in a scatter plot, that's the ideal way to look at a correlation between 2 quantitative variables. Okay? So I have 2 numbers or 2 metrics, and I want to see if they're related to each other, and a scatter plot helps me do that. So in the first one, so these are the data points, and this is the model that has been fit, the linear model, the blue line. Can you see this and venture whether the model is a good fit for the data? Does it capture the data sufficiently well? Maybe you can put your answer down in the chat window. So here you can just think about yes or no. Do you think it fits the model well? Okay, so I have 1 yes and 1 no. What about the others?
Ma'am, there have been a few no's, but they have come directly to me. So
I see. Okay, so you'll have to put this out to everybody, I think. So in the chat window, you'll have to address it to everyone in the meeting. Okay, I'm getting some direct messages as well. Okay, so a lot of you say yes. Okay, so definitely this line is quite effective in addressing what the data is. Right? So it's a moderate fit, and it's there is a correlation between X and Y that we can see, and our model is actually capturing. Now, if you look at the second graph over here, you will see that there is some relationship between X and Y, but it's definitely not a linear model. So we're looking at something that is actually curving. So our linear model doesn't really describe the data exactly how it is. So it's not that great a fit. Whereas in the third one, what you can see is this is a linear model, but it's a very different linear model than the one we have found. And there is one exception, one point that is very different from the others, which you can clearly see in the visualization. And of course, but X and Y are still correlated to each other. In the fourth one, we really don't see any correlation. Okay? So there is just one exception which makes the summary statistics very different from what it is, but actually while Y is changing, there really is no change in X. So we can clearly see that while the summary statistics was telling us that all 4 data models are exactly the same, the visualization clearly brings out some of the patterns that were not really very visible to us earlier. As Anjana mentioned earlier, data visualization is not really something very new. This has been around for many, many years. So they have been used very powerfully in a large number of situations to convey things, to help people make effective decisions, to actually save lives as well. So if you see the particular example over here, in terms of what a picture tells us, it's the greatest value for pictures when it forces us to notice what we never really expected to see. And this particular example brings that forth. This is regarding the cholera epidemic example that you spoke about. So this was, this map is set in London. This is a map of London in 1854. And at that point in time, we didn't have, or people didn't have a lot of knowledge about how cholera spread. So today, of course, we know how cholera spreads. How does it spread? Can you put down your answer in the chat window? This by water, right? Okay, so today we know that cholera spreads by water, but at that point in time, there was this general notion that people thought cholera actually was spread by air. So they didn't know it was spread by water. And there used to be repeated cholera epidemics, which used to be very widespread and quite deadly. At that point in time, there was a physician in London, and his name was John Snow. By the way, the name is just a coincidence. If you think John Snow rings a bell, that's just a coincidence. But John Snow had an inkling that cholera probably spread by water. And he started plotting this map about where the different casualties were occurring. So if you see all these different dots, you can see that each dot over here is marked by one person who actually died due to cholera during this current epidemic that he was actually marking. And if you see these crosses over here, these are water pumps. So these water pumps were their primary source of water for all their needs, including drinking. So if you start seeing this, can you spot a particular pattern emerging? Is there any particular pump that seems problematic? Right. So Srijan says the pump at Broad Street. Exactly. Right? So if you see, most of the dots are clustered around the pump at Broad Street. And that happened to be the source of the cholera epidemic. So the water pump at Broad Street had been contaminated. So as the story goes, John Snow took this map to the authorities to make his case that cholera spreads by water. Here's my proof. I feel the Broad Street pump water has been contaminated. And this was enough to actually convince the authorities. And they took one simple step. They went there and they just removed the handle of the water pump. Right? So these were these old water pumps where you had to actually pump out the water. So they just removed that handle and the epidemic came to a halt. So just that one simple step. And what's more, after that, people started paying a lot more attention to the sewage systems, to water management in urban areas. And today, if we live in cities with very sophisticated sewage systems, and we have clean water to drink, and we know how to dispose our waste hygienically, this map, we owe a lot to this map, because after this, urban sewage systems actually started getting revolutionized. So a simple data visualization can have very long-reaching effects. The second one that you see, this is also something Anjana mentioned, Napoleon's march to Moscow. So this is probably known as one of the best data visualizations ever created because of the immense impact it has in terms of what war can do or the futility of wars. So if you remember, if those of you who've read this, maybe in your history books or in any other context, Napoleon took a massive army and he marched all the way to Moscow, right? And at Moscow, because of the very frigid conditions there, his army was not really used to that. And he couldn't really conquer Moscow. The Russians held off. Moscow was too cold at that time, and they ran out of food, they ran out of other utilities, and they actually came back home. But what happened during the march? So this particular visualization is showing you that entire story with multiple dimensions. So the beige line that you see, that is the army marching towards Moscow. And then the black line you see is the army marching back from Moscow. Okay, that's the retreat. And the thickness of the line represents the number of soldiers who walked to Moscow and walked back, and the number of soldiers who actually got home alive. So you can see the massive army that set out, and just so many, so around 420,000 set out, and around only 10,000 came back home alive. So if I just thrown the numbers at you, it wouldn't have been very effective. Now you can straight away see how very, very futile that entire march to Moscow was. Right? So apart from showing the path that the army took, this visualization also shows you the temperatures during the retreat, because the winter conditions were very, very frigid, and the river crossings. So if you can see these squiggly lines over here. So these river crossings turned out to be very deadly. And because again, there were icy conditions and people would just break into the ice and fall into the water. And you can see these big dips over here, which is probably why this is called one of the most effective visualizations ever created. You can see the temperature dips here corresponding to what was happening to the army. The third graph that I want to show you, this is created by Florence Nightingale. And Florence Nightingale, you might have heard of her as the lady with the lamp. She was also a statistician in her own right. So she liked to talk about numbers. She used to plot her own graphs. And this particular graph, which is called a coxcomb graph, actually depicts deaths during the Crimean War. And what she's trying to show us, so it starts out over here in April 1854 to March 1855. And then you can see, so the time moves here in a circular fashion and then continues here. So she's plotting the number of deaths each month, and the colors are actually denoting the causes of the death. So most of the deaths, so these big gray shaded regions that you see, those are the largest number of deaths caused due to preventable reasons. So if they had more equipment, if they actually were able to get more medicines on time, all of these deaths in the front line could be prevented. So she was trying to create this graph to actually mobilize more resources for the soldiers who were dying quite unnecessarily in the front of the war. So this is what she says: to affect through the eyes what we fail to convey to the public through their word-proof ears. So our ears have stopped hearing. Let's try to get through them through our eyes. Why through our eyes? Because if we talk about our sensory regions, almost 80% of our input that we get in, 80% of the data comes through our visual system. So this is a very, very high bandwidth channel that goes into our eyes and from our eyes into our brains. Right? So that's why the visual system is so, so powerful. And that is why data visualization becomes this very powerful, intuitive way to get your audience to see and process a large amount of data and make sense of it. So this is a quote from Hal Darien. You might have heard of him. He's well known in the field of IT. So he says that we actually have a lot of data today. So to be able to understand it, harness it, extract value and visualize it and communicate, that is going to be a very, very important skill in the next few decades. Because essentially data is free and ubiquitous. There is too much of it, in fact. But harnessing it, making sense of it, visualization of data, effective visualization, is something not everybody is able to do. So that becomes the scarce factor. And not to say that you can't do it, but it's totally worthwhile to spend some time honing your skills to get effective at data visualization. Not just to go by the defaults of what a software will spill out for you, but to understand what you're doing, why you're doing, and create those effective graphs. Let's look at a very quick example here. So I'm showing you a very small data set, which means we have just 8 numbers over here. Now, we're looking at 2 different income levels, up to 50,000 and over 50,000, and 2 age groups, under 50, 50 and over, and college degree and no college degree. So there are essentially 4 groups over here. College degree with lower income, those who have college degrees with higher income, no college degrees, lower income, no college degrees, higher income. So out of these 4 groups, one group is an anomaly compared to the other 3 in terms of how job satisfaction changes over time. Can you spot which group that is? So your 4 choices are college degree with the 2 types of income and no college degree with the 2 types of income. One of them changes over time differently than the other 3. If you can put down your answer in the chat window. So you have, Abhi, you have to say no college degree and it has to be coupled with the particular income category as well. Okay, so no college degree under 50. No, so not the age. Okay, so the question is you have 4 choices. College degree, low income, college degree, high income, no college degree, low income, no college degree, high income. Okay, these are the 4 different categories of people we have. And then, of course, for each of these categories, you have data points, right? Their job satisfaction when they were under 50 and then their job satisfaction when they're 50 and over. So for one of these, the job satisfaction changes in a different way than the other 3. So your answer can only be, okay. So somebody, Abhi got it right now. So no college degree, higher income. Okay, so suppose, of course, this is a brain teaser. Even though there are only 8 data points, it's not easy to come up with the answer because you have to kind of be able to do a fair bit of data crunching in your head. But suppose instead of showing you the data in this form, I'd shown you this and asked you the same question. It's very obvious now, right? So no college degree, over 50,000, job satisfaction is actually decreasing over time. And for the other 3, it is actually increasing over time. This is the power of data visualization, being able to show data in a way that our brains can very quickly assimilate and get the insights out of. So essentially, you want to figure out which is that one graph that will actually bring out the message in your data very, very coherently so that your audience can see it and get that aha moment straight away. You don't want them to wrestle with the data to try and get the information out. So suppose I've shown you the same data in this form as clustered bars. Is the insight as evident in this one? Now you have to work for it, right? So now you have to be able to compare these individual bars and say, okay, this is increasing, the orange bar is increasing, the green bar is increasing, but the pink bars are decreasing. A lot more work to get the same insight out. Hence, it's not that data visualization will work all the time to get your insights out, but the right graph for the right message is the key to bringing out the information very, very coherently and very, very powerfully. So that powerful insight generation is possible if you choose the right graph. So what we're going to do now, of course, as I said, data visualization is a vast field that I could go on and on. But I'm just trying to get you to understand a little bit about the value of visualization and the value of being able to hone your skills so that you can come up with those aha graphs when you actually want to. So let me very quickly just talk about some of the different options that you want to think about when you want to create a visualization in terms of how you communicate with data. So when you want to communicate with a graph, you don't want to say something like, here's my data, let me dump it into a bar graph, and I'm done with my visualization, right? You have to restructure, reorient your thought process to say, wait a second, I'm creating a visualization for a purpose. What is that purpose? Who is my audience? What do I want my audience to understand? What will my audience think when they see the visualization? So first understand your audience, very, very important to do. And then figure out what is the message you want your audience to understand. So to distill it a bit further, in terms of the message, you can think about the relationship in the data that you actually want to bring about. Okay? So in terms of relationships, these are some standard classification. This classification is borrowed from Stephen Few's book, Show Me the Numbers, which is a great way, if you're new to data visualization, that's a great way to start your adventures in data visualization. If you have to read one book, I will say that is the book that you have to read, apart from my book, of course. And so let me just take you through some of the basic relationships you want to actually think about. Right? So the first relationship is comparison or ranking, a normal comparison. So you have entities and you want to compare them. Let's take a very quick example. Suppose I said, okay, there are different departments and I want to see the number of employees in each department in my company. That would be a simple comparison. And I could rank this as well. Right? I can sort it and then I look at a ranking relationship. And bar charts are the best for a ranking or comparison relationship. Could either use columns or you could use horizontal bars. There are nuances and trade-offs between when one can work versus the other. But I won't get into some of those details now because, again, that is a topic in itself. You could also use what are called lollipop graphs. These have been invented slightly more recently when you want to emphasize the data point, but also the length. And what you just saw, slope graphs. Slope graphs are very, very helpful when you actually want to show how some of these rankings have changed over time. Right? So you saw an example of a slope graph earlier. Suppose you want to show a trend. So you want to show how a particular variable is actually changing over time. The best possible way to show that would be to use lines. If you just have one data set, you could also use bars, which means the audience will be looking at the top of the lines to look at the trend. But even better is if you use a line to show, then you concentrate on the trend. You could also use something like this. This is called an area graph, but these are slightly tricky. They can land up being misleading. And I'll talk about these in a bit in terms of how you need to be careful if you decide to create area graphs. So you have individual categories. Better than this, if you want to show how individual categories are changing over time, use lines, simple lines of different colors. You could also think of using a connected scatter plot. So a connected scatter plot is slightly different. So it's a build-up of a traditional scatter plot where you have an X and Y on both axes. And the dots, of course, represent individual data points. But you also join the dots in chronological order so that you can see the passage of time as well. So that gives you an additional time element in your scatter plot. For correlation, typically it's a no-brainer. You should use a scatter plot. You're trying to see a correlation between two variables. In the sense, suppose I said, okay, temperature and ice cream sales, and I want to see if there's a correlation between the two. I can use a scatter plot for that. So on the x-axis, you would put down one variable, on the y-axis, another variable, and you want to see if there's a correlation. Of course, these are just some of the usual suspects I'm touching upon now. There are graphs and more graphs, but going by what your audience may or may not understand, usually it's a good idea to go with something familiar, something that your audience knows so that they can actually concentrate on the insight and the data rather than get confused about the construct itself. The next one is a bubble chart where you can put in a third dimension in terms of the size of the bubble as well. And so that incorporates three different variables at a time, X, Y, and the size of the bubble. Let's say we had temperature and we had ice cream sales and maybe a third dimension in terms of, okay, where are the particular actual humidity conditions. You could actually represent that as the third variable. The next relationship you want, sometimes that you might want to convey, is a distribution. So the easiest example you can think about is the distribution of grades in a particular exam in the classroom. So you have different students and you want to know how the grades have been distributed. How many got between 90 and 100, how many got between 80 and 90, and so on. So for a distribution, you could think about using a histogram. You could think about frequency polygons, where you just use the line to look at the shape of the distribution. Or if you want a very condensed form, you can think of a box plot as well. Again, if you are, some of these constructs look unfamiliar, all of these have been explained in my book, and they've also been explained in, so you'll find a wealth of literature even online in terms of essentially the basic constructs and how you can go about using. But knowing when to use them is the very important thing you should keep in mind. Strip plots are again something you can use for distribution, where you want to see every single data point. If you have a hierarchical kind of relationship you want to capture, right? So let's say I have different departments, and within different departments, I have different categories of people, and I want to capture that entire hierarchy. I can use something called a tree map. So this is a specialized construct just to visually capture hierarchies and how they've actually been the proportion for the different categories in a hierarchy. And finally, we have something called composition or part to whole, how certain elements relate to the whole. So for example, I say, okay, I have a classroom, and in the classroom, what is my split by gender? So that would be a composition. So, or if I say something like, okay, I'm actually going to, as you can see, ice cream comes a lot in my examples. You'll see that in the book as well. So you can take a classroom and you can ask them, what are your favorite flavors of ice cream? And so many said vanilla, so many said strawberry. So in terms of percentages, that becomes a composition. So you might want to think about pie charts. These are some of the usual suspects when you have a composition. But typically don't use a pie chart if you have too many categories, because it can get confusing. For 2 to 3 categories, pie charts actually work well, but not for a large number of categories. If you want to read more about pie charts, there's a very nice article by Stephen Few called Save the Pies for Dessert. It's available online. You can just Google Save the Pies for Dessert, and that will convince you to be very, very careful in how you use pie charts. Because most pie charts that are used today are actually quite useless. So you want to know when you can actually use them. Donut, save the donuts also for dessert. So only use donuts if you have a small number of categories and not for too many categories. They fall in the same category as pie charts. You could also think about stacked bar graphs if you have a small number of categories to work with. And finally, a Pareto is sometimes used in composition. So Pareto is nothing more than a standard bar graph with a cumulative line over here. So if you have the 80-20 rule or something similar to the 80-20 rule, where you have the contribution of some of the categories being very large. So let's say we were looking at wealth distribution across a particular country, and we want to look at the different categories of users, and you'll see a large amount of wealth concentrated in some small categories. This would be a good example, a Pareto graph, to actually bring out that very lopsided nature. So when we talk about the Pareto rule, it typically says that around 80% of the effect is because of 20% of the cause. And you'll see that working out in a large number of situations. So finally, I want to spend, we have 5 minutes or so, and then I'll wrap up. So this is my book, from which I'm going to show you some examples of how graphs can actually mislead. So while data visualization is a very, very powerful tool, it's a double-edged sword. So we have to be very, very careful when we create visualizations so that we're always truthful to the underlying data. And the art of being able to figure out that a graph is misleading also means you will not allow others to mislead you. You'll see graphs everywhere today. You'll open the newspaper, you'll see graphs. You open a report card, you'll see graphs. You open an annual report, you'll see graphs. So how do you make sure that they don't mislead you? Because it's actually quite omnipresent. We may not realize how popular, quote unquote, these misleading graphs are, but they're there all over the place. So this is just, I'll take you through a couple of examples from my book. These are examples that I start out with. So this it's a graph that is showing us nicotine levels in 4 different brands of cigarette. This is actually used by a cigarette company when they had to report their nicotine levels. So this was, of course, I've not given out the names of the brands, but this particular brand, which was reporting the nicotine levels, showed their level as very less compared to the competitor. Okay? So if you see this bar graph, an alarm bell should ring. So what is wrong with this bar graph? What is wrong with this bar graph is that the y-axis, the quantitative axis, is not starting at 0. Okay? Actually, these 4 numbers are not very different from each other in the context of nicotine level. This is just marginally lesser than the others. So a bar graph, it's a compulsory rule that a bar graph should start, the quantitative axis should start at 0. Otherwise, the ratios of the lengths of the bars don't represent the quantity. So if we fix this, this is the correct way to actually show this data, and you will see that they're just marginally lesser than the others. But you can see how stark it looks here. And if you start looking around, you'll find such graphs in a lot of places. So as a takeaway exercise, just try to spot the number of bar graphs you can find which don't start at 0. You find them all around. And the surprising thing is these graphs are created in Excel. So Excel, for example, very easily will allow you to truncate the axis and draw it wherever you want. So the other example is the perils of 3D constructs. So that's the other thing I usually say. There is only one place for all 3D graphs. Can you guess what that place is? What is the appropriate place for all 3D graphs? Show me what you think is a well-designed 3D graph, and I'll show you a better way to design it. But before that, which is the appropriate place for all 3D graphs? Can you put down your answers in the chat window? There is no wrong answer here. You can venture answers. PowerPoint. Okay. All right. So the answer I gave, misleading reports. Okay, we're getting closer. So my answer is the trash bin. The only place for all 3D graphs is the trash bin. Because there is no way to actually create a good 3D graph. Nothing, not market segmentation, nothing, only the trash bin. So you will see company Y here. Company Y actually looks the biggest, right, in terms of market share. And if we remove the 3D element, you will actually see that company Y is the smallest of all 3. And 3D graphs, just with the way things are positioned, they become very, very problematic to actually be able to analyze the data correctly. Because the numbers will be telling you something, but visually it's going to tell you something else. So even if you put the numbers here, visually your brain will be recording something else, the text part is looking at something else, and there's going to be a dissonance. So don't use any of these 3D graphs. Here's an example of a graph that has both the aspects we've talked about. This was from the World Happiness Report created, it was brought out by the United Nations. If you look at this very quickly, you might assume that males are actually twice as happy as females. So you can straight away see the problem in this graph. Well, males are, we definitely know. I hope they're not twice as happy as females. And the only saving grace in this graph is that the numbers are there. So, you know, it's just a very marginal difference, right? The second place in the decimal. The problem here is the truncated axis, as well as the 3D nature of the graph that makes what is towards you look much bigger than it is. So you can see both of those elements we talked about playing out in this graph. My third example is what is called, as I said earlier, this is an area chart. If you looked at this very quickly, you might think that we have 4 departments and all of them are peaking in March. Okay? But actually, this is the peril of a Y start from 0.66. That's exactly the problem, right? It's the truncated axis that we talked about. So if you look at the actual data, you can clearly see that one department is increasing and the other 3 have peaked in March. So these stacked area graphs become very problematic because these lines that you see are meaningless. They all depend on what is happening to the categories before it. And because the others were peaking, it looked like this also is peaking in March. So it can visually be very, very misrepresentative of the data. Okay, I hope I've convinced you that data visualization can be very, very powerful, but you have to be very careful in how the graphs are created so that you can maintain the integrity of the visualization. That is a very, very important aspect. So here's an example of using a graph with lines instead of stacked so that you can clearly see how the categories are changing. So let me just wrap up in a minute or so by pointing you to some resources which have helped me and I'm sure will help you. So this is my book that I've already spoken about. So this should be available in maybe February. It will be out in a couple of months. So it was already out, it's sold out, and they're going to bring out another edition in February. Show Me the Numbers by Stephen Few, a very, very wonderful book on the basics of data visualization. If you use Excel and you want to get really good at creating Excel charts, because these, my book and Stephen Few's book are tool agnostic. Data at Work will give you a lot of good tips on how to create very, very effective charts using Excel as a tool. In terms of tools, Excel is always an option. There's Power BI and Tableau for exploratory analysis. If you want to explore your data and get insights, it's a very good tool. And Data Wrapper is great if you want to create beautiful visualizations for presenting your data. There's a free version of Data Wrapper. There's a free version of Tableau called Tableau Public. ClickView, you could actually get, it's not very expensive. Google Charts is also a great way to create good visuals. It's also free. If you're not averse to programming, there is always ggplot in R, which is free. Python, available to everybody. Processing is again a free tool for creating interactive visualization. So as a beginner, if you want to experiment, there are a lot of free tools out there that will actually help you. In terms of blogs, there are tons and tons and tons of blogs on data visualization. These are some of my favorite ones: Perceptual Edge, Storytelling, Excel Charts, Information is Beautiful, and so on. So as a starting point, you can start with some of these blogs. So that is it from my side. And Anjana, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ranganathan. There are already comments in the chat window, saying wonderful presentation and very good presentation. So people are already coming out with their comments. We would like to, I have not yet seen any question. Anirban, did you see any questions as yet? Anyone? Yeah, I can see. Yeah. Please go ahead if there is any question. So, Dr. Ranganathan, the perils which you have shown about data, right? That is something even many of us have seen in our work life also, right? And this was really very helpful. Any tips you would like to give on to avoid perils, just from your experience?
So essentially, if we are presenting, if we are the presenter, if we are creating the graph, somewhere in our mind, we know what the truth is, right? So we know, because we know the data that we're presenting and we know what the data should convey, but there's always this litmus test, right? Is it, am I being truthful and am I crossing the line to show something that is not there in the data? So that bit is up to the individual in terms of, do I want to be truthful to the data or not? Sometimes, of course, it happens unknowingly, but many a time it is knowingly as well. You know that the outcome is not what the data is. So we want to then go back and make sure that it is what you know that the data, the base data is actually truthful in the visual. In terms of tricks, there are so many tricks, Anjana. So that's essentially what my book is all about, because there are so many different little things that you need to be careful about in terms of even the very simple design aspects in going about creating an effective visual. So that list is actually endless. So I just introduced you to a few examples here.
Thank you, Doctor. I see there's a question on the chat box. So one question has come is that what is the most versatile graph option? Is that something, is there any, yeah.
I'm not very sure I understand the question. What do we mean by the most versatile? Do you mean the most versatile tool for creating visualization?
I think so. We can take it as that.
Okay. All right. So in terms of tools, there are trade-offs. So I have personally used Tableau, and it's a wonderful tool in terms of being able to explore data. Very, very powerful tool for exploring data, getting the insights out. And everybody can try it for free. For example, Tableau Public is available for free for everybody. That said, if you want to create a presentation and you want to fine-tune every aspect of your graph, I personally find Excel very powerful for that. It allows you to change every aspect of your graph. So even if you don't use a tool like Tableau or Power BI, even if you have only Excel, there's a lot you can do with it, provided you invest some time in understanding the right construct for each context. That, for me, is more important than what the tool can or cannot do. Because the tools are there, but garbage in is garbage out, right? So the tools can only do so much. They cannot understand the context of what you're trying to say. They don't really understand the context of your data or the insight. That is still up to you. So I very powerfully believe in the human element actually making data visualization more powerful than the actual tool being able to do something.
Thank you. And then the next question, how difficult it is to learn data visualization for someone without much knowledge of statistics? That's a good question.
Actually, you don't need a background in statistics to actually start understanding the nuances of data visualization and getting good at it. You can pick up whatever statistics you need along the way, right? The basics of statistics. So I would actually say, even if you are not very comfortable with numbers per se, it doesn't really matter. If you start reading up about the subject, you will actually start falling in love with it, precisely because it doesn't bank only on numbers. Numbers are there, but they have their place. There are so many other elements. For example, just color. How do you manage your color in your visualization? That's an entire topic in itself. Right? In fact, that's going to be the topic of my next book. I'm talking about color and how you can actually leverage color in the visuals that you create effectively, and so on. So numbers, statistics is just one part, and there's a lot more to it beyond that.
Okay, thanks. The next question, there is a request for advice as to where we can get the maps to show concentration of population, etc., in a particular block or district of a state. Sorry.
Okay. Where to get, you mean the data or how to create the maps?
Where to get the maps to show concentration of population?
So the data should be available online, right? I haven't particularly tried to create population maps, but I would guess it would be very easily online available.
It
anywhere.
should be in the
You can
government
use it to,
databases.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can create choropleth maps. Those are the maps. That's the name of the map when you actually use color to encode different values across regions. And a tool like Tableau will very easily allow you to create these choropleth maps.
Okay. The next question, data can be manipulated. Do you think it can also be played with the human psychological behavior for the work to be done? Example, sales of a business.
Does it affect, do you mean in a positive way or a negative way? Yes, it can definitely, right? Because it can cook up a message that is not there in the data, which means it can definitely affect the audience and get the audience to believe something that is not really there in the data. But that's only if it's a misleading visual. It can also be a very, very powerful tool to convince somebody to do something and convince them about the message or the results of something in a positive way. So as I said, that's the double-edged sword bit in terms of how we saw examples in the beginning, right? So Florence Nightingale's graph. There's a more recent graph by Al Gore when he talks about climate change and he talks about the CO2 spike. It's a very, very powerful visualization, simple lines, but it shows you how things have changed in terms of global warming. So there's a lot that visuals can do for the good, as long as we're careful.
Okay. That was from Adhiraj Bhaduri. The next question is from Deepak K. Dhingra. Is there any curriculum-based certification available in market for data visualization?
I'm not very sure about that. I only teach at IMA, so I'm not sure about it. But I am told there are courses available on Coursera, maybe. So that's definitely worth checking out. But I wouldn't be able to endorse any of. I haven't really, seen the content or tried to take those courses. So I wouldn't be able to answer that one. Sorry.
Okay, and then the next question is advice as to where. Okay, we have done this already. I think we have covered most of the questions. One more is there. Which tool is currently used mostly for data visualization in the industry? I think you already answered. A similar question was there on, Tableau and.
No, I think this question is showing what should be the approach to choosing color on my graph? Any short rule that I should follow, since Dr. Ranganathan told that she's going to tell something about colors in her next book. Maybe this is something which has cropped up. What should be my approach to choosing color of my graph? Any short
So as I said, there's a lot to be said on the topic, right? So you essentially, but I can just give you one tip to begin with. Don't make your graph too colorful. If there are too many colors in your graph, your audience will not know where to look. Right? So start out with a blank slate and only add color, because whatever little color you add, your audience will straight away look at those elements. So first figure out where you want your audience to look. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose I said, okay, monthly sales of a particular product and they dipped in March. So I would start out with maybe no color and maybe just color in March with a different color so that your audience straight away sees what you want them to see in the graph, rather than putting in all different colors so that your audience is very confused and they don't know where to focus. So that's, you can use color to your advantage to get them to look at certain parts.
And madam, before we go to the end, before I ask Anjana ma'am to wrap up and then I ask GM sir to give the vote of thanks, I'm just cutting short here, I'm sorry. because we are at 6 o'clock. I know that we have to stick to time. I just want to tell everyone here, if you have any questions relating to this, you can please take down, I'll on the chat box, I'll also give the email ID of Calcutta Management Association. Please put down your questions. What we'll do is, if we have any further questions from ma'am, I'll send it up to her. And the questions, like you said, if there's any course on data visualization, I'll definitely, from CMA side, we'd like to explore that option and come back to you. So please put these questions on the email ID that I'll be providing on the chat box. It will help us to get back to you with your answers, and also definitely it will show us how much interest it creates, these kind of webinars. So all up to you. Anjana, I'm sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah, in interest of time, we will have to wrap up. There are more questions. Maybe we'll just take a look at the, which were not answered. If we can send it to Dr. Ranganathan for her kind inputs. So I think Dr. Ranganathan, very interesting session. So many things you've already given us insights on. And definitely, I plan to take further on to this, and I hope to be able to read your book soon. So over to you, Anirban, for the word of thanks. Yeah. Yeah, Doctor.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot, ma'am. Ma'am, Dr. Ranganathan, since you are coming up with another book in a few more days, we'll definitely have a option of bringing you back to this session. Because 1 hour is not at all, it's not doing justice to what you have started. Definitely, we would like to have you more often, but there are constraints, but we'll try to have you again on this platform. Just before I hand over to Mr. Kapoor for the formal vote of thanks, just I have on the chat box, I have given the email ID of Calcutta Management Association, admin@cmakolkata.in. Please put in your questions, your queries if they're ready. And we'll try to give answers to that, even if those are pertaining to your course and career. That is what CMA would like to do in future. And also, I've given you, I'll just put it once again, that there's a link of Dr. Ranganathan's book, the data book that she was referring to, which will be available from February probably, right, ma'am? Yeah. So what I'm doing is I'm also putting that link. I haven't given that link, Mr. Swami. So I'll just put it there. So those are the two things. And if I don't say this, maybe the participants will not be very happy about it. But once Mr. Kapoor finishes his speech, I'll be giving you the e-certificate links. So you have to stick till there. So another 5 to 10 minutes, please. So Mr. Kapoor, he's the executive committee member of Calcutta Management Association, and he has so many feathers on his crown. I really would not take much time, but he's known to many people. Mr. Kapoor, may I request you to kindly propose the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Anirban. And I'm not going to make a speech anyway. I'm just giving a formal vote of thanks. And basically, I would like to mention that I continue to learn every day, and this has been a learning experience also. It's a subject which I knew very little about. At least I've got some insight. Thank you very much, Kavitha. It's been great listening to you and enlightening us on this subject. And I do hope that, as Anirban has mentioned, we'll see you again as soon as your next book is ready or is published. Thank you very much, Ms. Anjana Dixit. It's been very nice of you to have introduced the subject, and as you introduced it with examples which are there in the book, it made it all the more interesting. And since you have a common thread between XLRI and, in fact, Kavitha's father-in-law, Professor Sareen, who may have taught you in XLRI. So anyway, thank you very much. And of course, many thanks to the Calcutta Media Institute, which has partnered with us in this event. And we look forward to further partnering with them in future programs. Our media partner, Telegraph, who has been kind enough to promote our program in the media. We also have been supported by another CMA, that is the Chandigarh Management Association, organization. We are grateful to them for their support, and I do hope their members have joined us in this program. Our digital partner has been Squash Code, and we are grateful to all the organizations and institutions who have joined us in this program. And of course, last but not least, all the participants who have joined us in listening to this very interesting program. Thank you, and thank you once again, all of you. I do hope we will have more such interesting programs in future. Over to you, Anirban.
So thank you. Thanks, everybody. We'll take leave and we'll again come back to you as I'll again go through the slides. On the chat, I've given you the e-certificate link that will also be shown on the slides. So we have many programs lined up in this month of December. Please go through it. And we would really love to have more members joining CMA and more people listening to CMA's value addition terms. Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Ranganathan. Thank you, Anjana ma'am. Thanks a lot to all the participants and all the sponsors. Thank you.